Miss Marple and the Halloween Photography Studio Mystery. Narrated by William from Mindful Musings. Welcome to Mindful Musings. I'm William, and tonight I invite you to step into the world of Miss Jane Marple, where beneath the surface of village life, dark secrets often hide in plain sight. Our story begins on a crisp Halloween evening in St Mary Mead, where the new photography studio promised festive family portraits but delivered something far more sinister. Settle in with your favourite warm beverage as we follow Miss Marple through shadows both literal and metaphorical in this tale of modern technology meeting timeless malice. Chapter 1. The Studio at Twilight. The October evening had settled over St Mary Mead with that particular quality of darkness that arrives earlier each day as autumn deepens toward winter. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her coat against the chill as she made her way along the high street, her sensible walking shoes clicking softly against the pavement. The village had transformed itself for Halloween with considerable enthusiasm. Paper skeletons danced in shop windows, carved pumpkins grinned from doorsteps, and children in various states of costume ran shrieking with delight between the houses designated for trick or treating. Her destination was the new photography studio that had opened just 6 months earlier in what had previously been Miss Weatherby's hat shop. The transformation had been quite remarkable. Where dusty windows had once displayed outmoded millinery, there now gleamed a modern establishment with sleek signage reading West Photography Studio in elegant silver letters. Through the large plate-glass windows she could see the warm glow of professional lighting equipment and the careful arrangement of backdrop screens. Miss Marple was not, generally speaking, much given to vanity regarding photographs. However, her great-niece Chloe had been visiting from London for the half-term holiday, and the child had been quite insistent about having a proper Halloween portrait taken. They had attended the 6 o'clock session, with Chloe dressed as a rather convincing young witch. The session had proceeded smoothly enough, though Miss Marple had noted certain aspects of Mr. Julian West's demeanour that she found vaguely disquieting in ways she could not immediately articulate. Now, at nearly 8 o'clock in the evening, she had returned to collect Chloe's forgotten school bag. As she approached the studio, Miss Marple observed that the front area was empty of customers, though the lights remained on and the door stood slightly ajar. She pushed the door open fully and stepped inside, causing a small bell to chime with cheerful brightness. The waiting area was pleasantly decorated in keeping with the holiday. Small paper bats hung from fishing line attached to the ceiling, and a bowl of wrapped sweets sat on the reception desk. Chloe's school bag was exactly where the child had left it. Miss Marple retrieved it, with a small sense of satisfaction. It was as she was turning to leave that she heard the sound. A muffled thump, followed by what might have been a groan, came from somewhere toward the back of the studio. Miss Marple paused, every instinct suddenly alert. She set down the school bag and moved quietly toward the source. The studio's main photography area was empty, its lights casting dramatic shadows. Beyond this room, a narrow hallway led to storage areas and the darkroom. The third door, at the end of the hallway, was closed. A red light glowed above it, indicating that darkroom work was in progress. Miss Marple approached this final door with growing concern. She knocked gently, then more firmly when no response came. The door remained stubbornly closed, and she could detect no sound of movement from within. Chapter 2. The Locked Darkroom. The front doorbell chimed again, announcing new arrivals. Miss Marple turned to see a family of 4 entering the waiting area, all dressed in elaborate zombie costumes. The father consulted his watch and called out cheerfully that they were the Pembers with an 8 o'clock appointment. Miss Marple returned to the waiting area, her expression carefully composed despite her growing unease. "I am afraid Mr. West appears to be occupied in his darkroom at the moment. Perhaps if we give him a few more minutes." 10 minutes passed, and Mr. Pember was beginning to check his watch with increasing frequency. Miss Marple suggested someone should check on West. She led Mr. Pember back down the dim hallway to the closed darkroom door. The red warning light still glowed steadily, but when they pressed their ears to the door, no sound came from within. Mr. Pember knocked firmly, then tried the handle. The door was locked. "I believe we should telephone for the police," Miss Marple said quietly, "and perhaps a doctor as well, though I fear it may already be too late for that." Inspector Wilkins arrived within minutes. After calling through the door without response, he ordered it broken down. It took 3 solid blows before the doorframe splintered. The door swung open to reveal the darkroom beyond, its red safety light casting everything in hellish crimson. The chemical smell of photographic developers was overwhelming. Mr. Julian West lay crumpled on the floor beside a steel developing table. Even in the uncertain red light, the pool of blood spreading beneath him was clearly visible. A heavy camera tripod, its base dark with blood, lay beside the body. "No one enters this room," Inspector Wilkins ordered sharply. "This is now officially a murder investigation." The police surgeon, Dr. Haydock, arrived within 20 minutes. After his examination, he announced that West had been dead for at least 30 to 40 minutes, killed by a single blow to the back of the head. Death would have been nearly instantaneous, though there were signs of a brief struggle. Inspector Wilkins began taking statements. Miss Marple provided a concise account of her return to collect the school bag, the sounds she had heard, and her discovery that the darkroom door was locked. She had seen no one leaving the studio as she arrived. The inspector consulted the appointment book. The 7:30 appointment had been the Ashford family. He asked if anyone knew them. A murmur ran through the assembled group. The Ashford family was well known in St. Mary Mead. "Where is the studio assistant?" Miss Marple asked suddenly. "Surely Mr. West employed someone to help with appointments." Inspector Wilkins frowned. He had seen no evidence of any other staff member. The assembled families looked at one another and shook heads. One mentioned seeing a young woman named Sophie at a previous session, but she had not been present that evening. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple remained seated. She had noticed something that niggled at her consciousness. It had to do with the red safety light above the darkroom door, but the significance escaped her for the moment. Inspector Wilkins approached her. "Miss Marple, you have a certain reputation for observation. I wonder if you noticed anything else relevant." "The darkroom was locked from the inside, Inspector. The key was in the lock. The window is far too small for human passage. Yet someone clearly entered that room and struck Mr. West down." She paused. "I believe the solution lies not in determining how the killer entered, but in understanding why Mr. West locked himself in during what should have been an active business evening." Chapter 3. The Missing Assistant. The following morning brought cold clarity to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple spent her breakfast reading the brief newspaper account of Mr. West's death, which reported it in terms of careful neutrality. She was clearing away her breakfast things when the telephone rang. Inspector Wilkins's voice carried frustration. "Miss Marple, I wonder if you might visit the studio again this morning. We have been unable to locate the assistant you mentioned. Sophie Mercer is her name, and she appears to have vanished. Her landlady says she left for work yesterday afternoon and never returned home." 20 minutes later, Miss Marple arrived at the studio to find it transformed into a hive of official activity. Inspector Wilkins greeted her and led her to the small office. The office was cramped and cluttered with filing cabinets and paperwork. "We have been going through Mr. West's business records," the inspector explained. "The financial situation appears sound." However, he paused. "We have found something rather disturbing." He produced a folder containing several letters, all complaining about inappropriate behavior during photography sessions. 4 letters in total, from 4 different families, all of whom had appointments scheduled for yesterday evening's Halloween sessions. Miss Marple read through the letters with growing distaste. The complaints described unwanted comments, uncomfortable, positioning during shoots, and promises to delete unflattering photos that were never honoured. "These are formal complaints. Were they filed with the police?" Inspector Wilkins nodded grimly. All 4 families made official reports within the past 3 months. However, the complaints were difficult to substantiate. Without concrete evidence of criminal wrongdoing, we could take no direct action. He pulled out his notebook. 4 families with grievances, all scheduled for sessions during the evening when Mr. West was killed. The inspector reported that all 4 families had been interviewed. The Thorntons were trick-or-treating with neighbours and had multiple witnesses. The Ashfords presented a more complicated situation. Marcus Ashford admitted arriving for their 7:30 appointment, but said they left after only 10 minutes, having decided not to employ West's services. Several neighbours saw their car parked at home by 8:15. "Which brings us back to the question of Sophie Mercer," Inspector Wilkins said. He led Miss Marple to the darkroom, now thoroughly processed by investigators. In the harsh light of portable lamps, the room lost its mysterious quality. West had been working with traditional film negatives when he died. Several strips of developed film hung from drying lines. "What was he developing?" Miss Marple asked. Inspector Wilkins lifted one of the film strips to the light. "It appears to be candid photography. People in various stages of undress, changing clothes perhaps." He paused. "We discovered 2 hidden cameras this morning, small digital devices disguised as electrical outlets in the changing room. They transmitted wirelessly to a receiver in West's office." Miss Marple felt a chill of understanding. So Mr. West was secretly photographing his clients while they changed, then developing these invasive photos using traditional film to avoid leaving digital evidence. Precisely. The digital cameras captured the images, but West transferred them to film negatives before deleting the digital files, a clever way to avoid detection. We also found evidence of blackmail, email communications demanding payment in exchange for not posting the invasive photos online. Miss Marple walked slowly around the darkroom. 4 families with motive, all scheduled for Halloween sessions. A locked darkroom that somehow admitted a killer, and a missing assistant who might have discovered her employer's criminal enterprise. She paused. Sophie Mercer. What do we know about her background? 24 years old, moved here 6 months ago when West opened the studio. Lives in a rented room. No close family in the area. Her references checked out. Has anyone checked whether Sophie herself might have been a victim of West's hidden cameras? The inspector's expression darkened. "We are reviewing all the footage now. Yes, Sophie does appear in some recordings. She occasionally used the changing room, so Sophie may have discovered that her employer was secretly photographing her as well as the clients." Miss Marple noticed something on the wall. A certificate for completion of a course in photographic darkroom ventilation systems, dated 3 months earlier, issued in Sophie Mercer's name. "Inspector, I believe Miss Mercer had rather more technical knowledge about this building's construction than we have been assuming." Chapter 4. The Ventilation System. Inspector Wilkins immediately summoned his sergeant to examine the darkroom's ventilation system. Sergeant Collins studied the ventilation grate with professional interest, standing on a chair to reach it. "This is connected to the main building ductwork," he observed. "Standard installation for a darkroom. You need continuous air exchange to prevent chemical fume buildup, but you cannot have windows that would let in light." "Can a person fit through that duct?" Inspector Wilkins asked directly. The sergeant carefully removed the grate using a screwdriver. The opening behind was approximately 18 inches square, leading into a metal duct that disappeared into darkness. He shone his flashlight into the opening. "A small person might manage it. It would be extremely tight, and you would have to crawl on your belly for several feet." He directed his light along the visible section. "And there is dust disturbed here. Fresh disturbance. You can see where something has passed through recently." Miss Marple stepped closer to examine the evidence. Someone had indeed crawled through this duct recently enough that the disturbed dust had not yet resettled. She also noticed tiny black fibres caught on a rough seam in the metal ductwork. "Inspector, I believe we should examine Sophie Mercer's Halloween costume, assuming she was wearing one yesterday evening." According to her landlady, Miss Mercer left for work, wearing what appeared to be a cat burglar costume. Black clothing, a mask, the whole ensemble. "Cat burglar," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "How appropriate. Black clothing that would show dust and cobwebs quite clearly if one were crawling through ventilation ducts." Inspector Wilkins called for building plans to be retrieved. Within the hour, plans arrived, showing the ventilation system was extensive. The main shaft ran vertically through the building, with horizontal ducts branching off to serve each room. Access points were marked at several locations, one in the roof space, one in the basement, and one in a small utility closet on the ground floor. They located the utility closet at the back of the building. It was cramped, filled with cleaning supplies and electrical boxes. There, at the back near the ceiling, was another ventilation grate. This one had clearly been removed recently. The screws lay on the floor, and there were scuff marks on the walls. More significantly, there were muddy footprints, small prints suggesting a woman's shoes. The grate was resting against the wall rather than properly installed. Someone removed. It crawled into the duct system, then failed to replace it properly afterward. Inspector Wilkins examined the wall scuffs. The mark suggests someone used the shelving unit for leverage. Small hands. So, Sophie Mercer could have entered the ventilation system through this closet, crawled through the ducts to the darkroom and dropped down into the room where West was working. She committed the murder, then exited the same way, leaving the darkroom door locked from inside because she never used it. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Inspector, you mentioned that West was blackmailing certain clients. Have you determined the full extent of his operation? We are still working through his records. It appears to have been quite extensive. Dozens of clients over the past 6 months. I wonder whether any of those blackmail victims had personal connections to Sophie Mercer. Family members, perhaps, or close friends. That would provide a much stronger emotional motivation for murder. Inspector Wilkins made notes. You are suggesting Sophie's motive was not merely that she worked for a criminal, but that someone she cared about was among his victims. That would provide motivation, Miss Marple observed, particularly if she had been paying West from her own modest salary to protect someone else's privacy. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused at the reception desk. The appointment book lay open. She studied it carefully, noting brief annotations beside entries. Inspector, look at these notes beside the appointments. They appear to be in a different handwriting. Sophie Mercer's handwriting, she would have been responsible for confirming appointments. But look at what she noted beside the 7:30 Ashford appointment. The inspector read aloud. Mother's session, paid in full, delete all files. Why would Sophie specifically note that files should be deleted? Miss Marple felt pieces clicking into place. Inspector, I believe we should inquire into Sophie Mercer's family background. Specifically, whether her mother might have been a client of Mr. West's studio. Chapter 5. The Cat Burglar's Costume. The search for Sophie Mercer continued without success. Inspector Wilkins had officers checking every possible hiding location in St. Mary Mead, but the village offered surprisingly many possibilities. Miss Marple spent the afternoon considering what she knew of Sophie's character from their brief interactions. The young woman had been efficient and pleasant, showing genuine care for clients. These were not the actions of someone naturally inclined toward violence. Miss Marple recalled something Sophie had said during their session. The young woman had mentioned finding Halloween melancholy because it reminded her of celebrating with her late father, who had died when Sophie was a teenager. Her mother had struggled financially afterward, which was why Sophie had been so grateful for steady employment. This detail took on new significance. The daughter who had lost her father and watched her mother struggle would have been particularly vulnerable to protective impulses. The discovery that West was exploiting her mother would have triggered profound betrayal. Miss Marple was considering these factors when Inspector Wilkins telephoned, his voice carrying suppressed excitement. Miss Marple, we have found Sophie Mercer's costume, or rather parts of it. They were discovered in several different locations around the village, apparently discarded as she fled. The black trousers were found in a rubbish bin behind the chemist's shop. The top was stuffed under a hedge near the village green, and the mask was discovered in the churchyard, tucked behind a gravestone. The gravestone of a Mr. Robert Mercer, who died 12 years ago. Sophie's father, Miss Marple said quietly. Precisely. It appears she visited her father's grave after the murder. The clothing is covered with dust and cobwebs, particularly around the back and elbows, exactly as expected from crawling through ductwork. We also found chemical stains on the sleeves matching the developing solutions. What about the gloves? Miss Marple asked. A cat burglar costume would surely include gloves. You're right. The landlady mentioned black, fingerless gloves. We have not recovered them yet. I suggest you search the studio's rubbish bins again. If the gloves were contaminated with blood, Sophie would have needed to dispose of them carefully. That evening, Inspector Wilkins called again, his tone more troubled. We found the gloves wrapped in paper towels in the studio bin. They tested positive for blood matching West's type. However, there is something else rather disturbing. We found a letter Sophie left in her lodgings, addressed to her mother, but clearly intended for police as well. Her landlady discovered it tucked into a book. What does the letter say? It is essentially a confession. Sophie describes discovering West's hidden cameras 3 weeks ago while cleaning. She found the wireless receiver and accessed the transmitted footage. She saw recordings of herself, her mother, and dozens of other women, all captured without consent. The poor child must have been devastated. The letter describes how Sophie confronted West about the cameras. He threatened to post the most compromising photos of her mother online if Sophie reported him. He also threatened to claim Sophie had been complicit in the operation if she tried to expose him. A cruel trap, Miss Marple observed. Sophie's letter explains she began planning West's murder after discovering he was continuing to install hidden cameras in other businesses. She felt that if she did not stop him, he would continue victimizing people indefinitely. The inspector's voice was heavy. The letter ends with what can only be interpreted as a suicide note. Sophie writes that she has completed what she set out to do, that her mother and the other victims will now be free, and that she cannot live with what she has done. She asks her mother's forgiveness and indicates she plans to join her father. When was this letter written? Yesterday afternoon, before Sophie left for work. Then we must find her immediately. A young woman in such a state, particularly one who has just committed murder, might do something irrevocable. The search intensified, with particular attention to locations that might attract someone contemplating self-harm. Miss Marple thought again about Sophie's visit to her father's grave. She put on her coat and made her way to the churchyard. She found Robert Mercer's grave easily, well tended with fresh flowers. Standing beside it, Miss Marple tried to imagine what Sophie had felt after committing murder. She noticed a small wooden cross beside the official gravestone, handmade and weathered. Tucked into its base was a piece of paper in a plastic bag. Miss Marple retrieved it carefully. It was a brief note in Sophie's handwriting. "Father, I have done what I thought was right, but I cannot live with what I have become. Please forgive me, and please watch over Mother. I will be with you soon." The note was dated yesterday evening, time-stamped 11:47 p.m. Miss Marple immediately telephoned Inspector Wilkins. The note suggests suicide, but where would she go? Not the river or quarry. Too public. Sophie would want privacy, but would want to be found eventually so her confession would not be in doubt. "The studio," Miss Marple said with sudden certainty. She would return to where she committed the murder. It has symbolic significance, and she would know it would be searched regularly. She could hide there temporarily, then complete her suicide, in a way ensuring discovery. Inspector Wilkins organised an immediate search. Miss Marple insisted on accompanying them despite the late hour. The studio was dark and silent. They entered cautiously. The main photography area was empty. The office showed no disturbance, but when they reached the utility closet where the ventilation access was located, they found the door standing open. Inspector Wilkins shone his torch into the cramped space and froze. There, wedged in the corner beneath the ventilation grate, was Sophie Mercer. She was conscious but in considerable distress, pale and breathing shallowly. Beside her was an empty pill bottle. "We need an ambulance immediately," Miss Marple said. "She has taken an overdose." As the inspector made the call, Miss Marple carefully entered the closet and knelt beside Sophie. "Sophie, my dear, help is coming. You must hold on." Sophie's lips moved. "I am sorry. I could not let him continue. Mother, the other women, I understand. What was done to you and your mother and the others was terribly wrong. But this is not the answer. Too late. Already done. Pills, hours ago." Sophie's eyes drifted closed. "Came here after midnight. Wanted to be where it ended." The ambulance arrived within minutes. Sophie was stabilized and transported to hospital, with Inspector Wilkins accompanying her. Miss Marple stood in the empty studio, surrounded by equipment West had used for both legitimate art and criminal exploitation. The case was reaching its conclusion, but the true reckoning was only beginning. Chapter 6. The Photographic Evidence. The following morning brought news that Sophie Mercer had survived her suicide attempt. The doctors had counteracted the overdose, though she remained in serious condition under police guard. Inspector Wilkins had taken her preliminary statement confirming everything they had deduced. Miss Marple received this news with mixed emotions. Relief that Sophie had survived, but sadness at the chain of events that had driven her to desperation. Inspector Wilkins telephoned requesting she come to the police station. "We are going through all of West's photographic evidence. It is a massive undertaking, and I could use your perspective on handling certain aspects sensitively." Miss Marple arrived to find the station's conference room converted into an evidence processing centre. Walls were covered with timelines and charts. The actual photographs and footage were kept on secured computers with strictly limited access. "We have identified 43 victims so far," Inspector Wilkins reported. "Women and teenage girls photographed without consent in the changing room. West's blackmail operation was even more extensive than we initially thought. Demands ranged from £500 to £5,000, depending on perceived vulnerability." Miss Marple studied the timeline, and all of this occurred over 6 months since he opened the studio. Precisely. West had refined his operation from his previous business in another county. "We contacted police there. He left under suspicious circumstances, though no charges were filed. Several women complained about inappropriate behaviour, but without concrete evidence, nothing could be proven. He simply moved and started again," Miss Marple observed. "A predator who had learned to exploit both technology and the law's limitations. The hidden cameras were sophisticated, nearly impossible to detect without specialized equipment. They transmitted footage wirelessly to his private server. He would then transfer selected images to traditional film negatives to avoid leaving digital trails." "A clever system," Miss Marple admitted. "Digital capture, but film processing to create physical evidence that would not appear in digital forensic searches." The inspector gestured to evidence boxes. "We found hundreds of developed negatives hidden throughout the studio. False wall panels, hollowed books, even a hidden floor safe. And Sophie Mercer's mother." Inspector Wilkins consulted a file. "Mrs. Diane Mercer came here in July for a boudoir session. Intimate portraits meant to be empowering, typically kept strictly private. West photographed her with full consent for the actual session. However, he also secretly recorded her changing clothes using hidden cameras. Then he used those unauthorized images for blackmail. He contacted Mrs. Mercer 2 weeks later, claiming there had been a security breach, and her photos might be leaked unless she paid for enhanced security. Initial demand was modest, £200, but once she paid, he increased demands, threatening to post the changing room footage if she did not continue paying. Mrs. Mercer must have been terrified. According to her statement this morning, she was devastated. She considered going to police, but was ashamed and frightened about images being made public. She also worried that if West was arrested, the photos would become evidence others might see. So she paid, draining her modest savings. And Sophie discovered this. About 6 weeks ago, Mrs. Mercer broke down and confessed why she was having financial difficulties. Sophie was furious, but convinced her mother not to go to police yet. Instead, Sophie began paying the blackmail herself, taking extra hours to earn more money. All the while working for the man exploiting her mother. "A terrible situation," Miss Marple observed. Inspector Wilkins showed her another document. "This is Sophie's detailed confession, written yesterday before her suicide attempt. It explains how she first suspected something wrong when she noticed West spending excessive time developing traditional film. Digital photography had made film nearly obsolete, so his continued use seemed odd. A clever observation. Sophie began investigating quietly, using her technical knowledge to access West's computer systems. She found the hidden camera feeds and archived footage. She also discovered West was expanding his operation, with plans to install similar systems in other local businesses. He had approached several beauty salons and changing facilities, offering to install security cameras as a supposed safety measure, so he was franchising his exploitation. Exactly. Sophie realized that if she simply reported him, he might hide evidence or claim it had been planted. She also feared victims would be re-traumatized by having their images become public evidence, so she decided to take matters into her own hands. Miss Marple studied the timeline, noting the careful planning. She surveyed the ventilation system in advance, made sure she could physically navigate the ductwork and access the darkroom when West would be alone and vulnerable. Her confession is detailed about her preparations. She waited until Halloween because she knew the studio would be busy, providing legitimate reasons to be on premises. The Halloween theme allowed her to wear a costume practical for crawling through ducts without drawing attention, and the murder itself. Sophie entered the ventilation system through the utility closet at approximately 7:40. She had confirmed West was alone in the darkroom by checking the computer, monitoring the appointment schedule. She crawled through the ductwork, which took several minutes due to confined space and need for silence. Miss Marple imagined the scene, the young woman, driven by protective fury, crawling through dark, narrow ducts toward confrontation. Sophie removed the ventilation grate from inside the darkroom. The noise was minimal, and West was focused on developing work, wearing headphones to listen to music. Sophie dropped down behind him. Only then did he realize someone else was present. And the struggle. According to Sophie, West immediately understood what was happening. He recognized her despite the mask and realized she must have discovered his operation. He tried to reach for his phone, but Sophie grabbed the camera tripod. There was a brief struggle during which West tried to defend himself, explaining the defensive wounds. But Sophie struck him once across the back of the head, and he fell. A single blow. Death nearly instantaneous. Yes. Sophie checked for a pulse and realized West was dead. She panicked briefly but forced herself to think clearly. She climbed back into the ductwork, pulling the grate closed. The darkroom remained locked from inside, just as West had left it. Creating the locked room mystery. Sophie's technical knowledge served her well. She understood people would assume the locked door meant no one could have entered through conventional means. She was gambling no one would think to check the ventilation system. But she left evidence nonetheless. Sophie admits she did not think as clearly as she should have. The emotional toll was greater than anticipated. After exiting, she hid in the utility closet for several minutes, trying to compose herself. Then she left through the back entrance and began disposing of her costume around the village and her visit to her father's grave. That seems to have been unplanned, an emotional response. Sophie felt an overwhelming need to visit her father, to somehow explain or justify her actions to his memory. She left the mask at the gravestone as a symbolic gesture. Miss Marple understood this impulse perfectly. A young woman who had lost her father and committed murder defending her mother would naturally seek comfort in the memory of the parent who could no longer guide her. Inspector Wilkins showed her a final document. Sophie kept detailed records of all blackmail payments West demanded from her mother. She also documented dates and amounts from other victims she observed while working. She created a complete ledger of West's operation, evidence crucial in identifying all victims and providing them support. Precisely. Sophie's records allow us to contact everyone victimized without requiring them to come forward voluntarily. We can offer counseling, legal support, and assurance their private images will be destroyed rather than retained as evidence. A thoughtful approach. These victims deserve protection as well as justice. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple reflected on the case's complexity. Sophie had committed murder, but in service of protecting vulnerable victims from a predator who systematically exploited them. Inspector, I hope the court will take into account the circumstances that drove Sophie to violence. West's crimes created a situation where legitimate avenues of justice seem closed to his victims. I shall ensure the full context is presented to the Crown Prosecution Service. Sophie's actions were wrong, but they were not unprovoked. The law must balance punishment with understanding. Miss Marple walked home thinking about the photographs that had caused such harm. Images meant to capture beauty, corrupted by West's predatory behaviour into instruments of exploitation. The camera, like any tool, could be used for good or ill. West had chosen ill, and Sophie had responded with violence born of desperation. The case was solved, but its implications would trouble her for some time. Chapter 7. The Digital Footprints. Several days after Sophie Mercer's confession, Inspector Wilkins asked Miss Marple to review additional evidence that had emerged from West's electronic devices. The photographer had been meticulous in his criminal enterprise, but even careful criminals left digital traces. They met again in the police station's conference room. The inspector had clearly spent considerable time organising the electronic evidence into comprehensible patterns. I wanted you to see this because it confirms several of your observations and reveals the true scope of West's operations, the inspector explained. He gestured to a laptop displaying a complex spreadsheet. This is West's blackmail ledger, recovered from an encrypted partition on his computer. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and studied the screen. The spreadsheet was disturbingly comprehensive, with columns for victim names, amounts demanded, amounts paid, dates of contact, and notes about each victim's perceived vulnerability. She counted 47 distinct entries, each representing a person whose privacy had been violated and who had been systematically exploited. West was remarkably organised in his criminality. she observed quietly. This level of documentation suggests someone who viewed blackmail as a business rather than isolated criminal acts. Inspector Wilkins nodded grimly. The spreadsheet reveals patterns we might otherwise have missed. For instance, West increased demands on victims who paid promptly, interpreting their compliance as weakness to be further exploited. Conversely, victims who resisted initial demands were sometimes offered reduced amounts to establish the payment pattern. Psychological manipulation added to the technological exploitation, Miss Marple said. A thoroughly reprehensible individual. The inspector opened another file. We also recovered West's communications with potential business partners. He was actively marketing his hidden camera systems to other photographers and business owners. He called it a privacy security system and claimed it protected businesses from false accusations by creating objective records of all interactions, a grotesque perversion of legitimate security concerns. Indeed, we have identified at least 6 other businesses in neighbouring counties where West installed similar systems. All are being investigated now. The scope of his criminal enterprise extended far beyond St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple felt a chill at this revelation. How many additional victims might there be? We are still determining that, but preliminary estimates suggest well over 100 people across multiple locations. West had been operating variations of this scheme for at least 3 years, moving to new areas when suspicions arose in his previous locations. The inspector showed her another document. This is particularly relevant to Sophie Mercer's case. We recovered emails between West and Sophie dating back several weeks. The exchange reveals the psychological torture West inflicted. The emails showed West's calculated cruelty. After Sophie discovered the hidden cameras and confronted him, he sent her daily messages reminding her of his power over her mother's privacy. He included thumbnail images from the hidden camera footage, just enough to demonstrate what he could release publicly. He also increased the blackmail demands on Mrs. Mercer immediately after Sophie's confrontation, punishing the daughter through the mother. Monstrous behaviour, Miss Marple said quietly. The young woman was trapped in an impossible situation, watching her mother suffer while being unable to protect her through legitimate means. Inspector Wilkins displayed another file. Sophie's computer shows she spent considerable time researching legal remedies. She contacted 3 different solicitors anonymously through encrypted email services, inquiring about options for victims of blackmail and hidden camera surveillance. All 3 gave her the same discouraging news. Without concrete proof that would hold up in court, and without victims willing to testify publicly, prosecution would be nearly impossible. So Sophie concluded that the legal system could not help her. Worse than that, she concluded that going through legal channels would likely expose her mother and other victims to exactly the public humiliation West was threatening. Court proceedings would make the images part of public record, accessible to anyone, including the media. West had structured his operation specifically to exploit victims' fear of exposure. Miss Marple studied the timeline of Sophie's communications. When did she begin planning the murder? Based on her internet search history, approximately 2 weeks ago. She researched building ventilation systems, specifically darkroom ventilation requirements. She also researched the effects of blunt force trauma and how to avoid leaving forensic evidence. Her searches were careful and methodical. Premeditation clearly established. Unfortunately, yes. The inspector showed her another file. However, there is context that the defense will certainly present. Look at Sophie's diary entries during this period. She granted us access to her personal journal. The diary entries were heartbreaking. Sophie wrote about her anguish watching her mother's health deteriorate under the stress of blackmail. Mrs. Mercer had developed insomnia and anxiety, lost weight, and begun having panic attacks. Sophie described feeling helpless and furious that a predator could operate with impunity while his victims suffered in silence. The diary also revealed Sophie's moral struggle with what she was planning. She wrote extensively about whether murder could ever be justified, about her father's values and what he would think of her choices, about her fear that killing West would make her as monstrous as him. The final entries before Halloween showed someone who had concluded that protecting her mother and stopping West from creating more victims justified the terrible action she was about to take. These entries will be crucial for the defense, Miss Marple observed. They show a young woman driven to desperate action by circumstances that offered no legitimate remedy. Inspector Wilkins closed the laptop and looked at Miss Marple thoughtfully. "I must admit, this case has troubled me more than most. West's crimes were heinous and systematic. His victims were trapped in situations where seeking justice through proper channels would have caused them additional harm. Sophie's solution was criminal, but it is difficult not to feel some sympathy for her impossible position." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "The law exists to prevent vigilante justice, and rightly so. Society cannot function if individuals take it upon themselves to execute those they deem guilty. Yet this case reveals how modern technology can create situations where traditional legal protections prove inadequate." The inspector gathered his files. The Crown Prosecution Service is still determining what charges to pursue. Murder is certain, but there is considerable debate about whether to seek a murder conviction or accept a manslaughter plea based on diminished responsibility and extreme provocation. "And the victims," Miss Marple asked. "How are they being supported through this process?" "That has been our priority. We have established a dedicated victim support program with counseling services and legal advocates. Every victim has been contacted privately and assured that their images will be destroyed under court supervision. None of the actual photographs will be presented as evidence, only descriptions and technical documentation. A sensitive approach," Miss Marple approved. "These people have suffered enough without having their most private moments displayed in a courtroom." As she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Inspector, what will become of the studio itself? The building's owner is terminating the lease. The space will be completely renovated before being let again. All of West's equipment has been seized as evidence. His photographic business, such as it was, has been permanently closed." Miss Marple walked home through the November afternoon, her mind heavy with the complexity of justice. Sophie Mercer would face punishment for taking a life, but the circumstances that drove her to murder would also be acknowledged. The legal system would do its best to balance accountability with compassion, though Miss Marple suspected no outcome would feel entirely satisfactory to anyone involved. The case had revealed uncomfortable truths about how technology enabled exploitation on unprecedented scales, and how legal systems designed for earlier eras struggled to protect victims of digital-age crimes. West had been stopped, but Miss Marple wondered how many others like him operated in the shadows, using cameras and computers to trap vulnerable people in webs of fear and shame. Chapter 8. The Courtroom Testimony. 3 months after Sophie Mercer's arrest, her case came before the Crown Court. Miss Marple had been called as a witness regarding her discovery of the crime scene and her observations of Sophie's character during their earlier interactions at the studio. She sat in the witness waiting area, her knitting in her lap, watching the legal machinery of justice proceed with its deliberate formality. The courtroom was smaller than she had expected, panelled in dark wood that gave it a sombre dignity. Sophie sat in the dock looking pale and diminished in her prison clothing, a far cry from the efficient young woman Miss Marple had encountered at the photography studio. Mrs. Diane Mercer sat in the public gallery, her face drawn with anguish at seeing her daughter on trial for murder. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Sophie Mercer had methodically planned and executed the murder of Julian West. She had surveyed the ventilation system, prepared her costume for crawling through the ductwork, and struck West down with premeditated violence. The evidence was overwhelming. Her confession, the physical traces in the ventilation system, the blood-stained gloves, and her own detailed account of the crime. The defense, however, presented extensive context. West's hidden camera operation, his systematic blackmail of over 40 victims, and the particular cruelty of his exploitation of Sophie's mother were all documented in careful detail. The defense argued for a manslaughter verdict based on extreme provocation and diminished responsibility, pointing to Sophie's deteriorating mental state as she watched her mother suffer while feeling powerless to help through legitimate means. Miss Marple was called to testify on the second day of the trial. She took her place in the witness box and answered the prosecution's questions about discovering the crime scene with precise accuracy. When the defense attorney rose for cross-examination, his questions focused on her observations of Sophie's character. "Miss Marple, during your interaction with Miss Mercer at the photography session with your great-niece, did you observe anything in her behaviour that suggested violent tendencies?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. Quite the opposite. Miss Mercer was gentle and patient with my great niece, showing genuine kindness in helping adjust the child's costume and suggesting poses that would create pleasant memories. Her demeanour was that of someone who cared about making others comfortable and happy. Would you say she appeared to be someone capable of planning and executing a murder? I would say she appeared to be someone who took her responsibilities seriously and who possessed considerable technical competence. Whether those qualities could be turned toward criminal purposes would depend entirely on circumstances that might drive her to such desperate action. The defence attorney nodded. "Thank you, Miss Marple. That is all." The trial continued for another week, with expert testimony about the psychology of blackmail victims, the legal inadequacies in protecting people from hidden camera surveillance, and Sophie's mental state at the time of the murder. A psychiatrist testified that Sophie had been suffering from acute stress and moral injury, conditions that impaired her judgment while not eliminating her understanding that murder was wrong. The most compelling testimony came from several of West's victims who bravely agreed to speak publicly about their experiences. A young mother described how West's blackmail had driven her to the edge of bankruptcy and suicide. An elderly woman explained how the shame of being photographed without consent had left her unable to leave her home for weeks. A teenage girl, now 18, testified about the lasting psychological damage from discovering that intimate images captured when she was 17 were being used for blackmail. Each victim's testimony reinforced the defence's central argument. West had been a predator who exploited legal loopholes and technological sophistication to create a criminal enterprise that trapped victims in positions where seeking legitimate justice seemed impossible. The judge's instructions to the jury were careful and thorough. He explained that sympathy for Sophie's circumstances could not excuse murder, but that they were entitled to consider whether those circumstances reduced her culpability from murder to manslaughter. The jury was to determine whether a reasonable person in Sophie's position, faced with the same impossible choices, might have lost self-control in a way that made her actions less than fully deliberate murder. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning their verdict. The courtroom was packed with spectators, including many of West's victims who had come to see justice done in whatever form it might take. The foreman stood when the judge asked for the verdict. On the charge of murder, we find the defendant not guilty. A murmur ran through the courtroom. On the lesser charge of manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty. Sophie's shoulders sagged with what appeared to be relief. Mrs. Mercer closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. The verdict acknowledged Sophie's crime, while also recognizing the extraordinary circumstances that had driven her to it. The sentencing hearing took place a week later. The judge considered extensive submissions from both prosecution and defense about the appropriate penalty. The prosecution argued that even manslaughter motivated by protective impulses required substantial punishment to maintain respect for the law's prohibition on taking human life. The defense presented evidence of Sophie's remorse, her previous good character, and the systematic victimization that had driven her to violence. The judge's sentencing remarks were measured and thoughtful. He acknowledged the horror of West's crimes and the impossible position in which Sophie had found herself. He noted that the legal system had failed to provide adequate protection for West's victims, creating circumstances where desperate action seemed like the only option. However, he emphasized that society could not tolerate vigilante justice, even when directed at reprehensible criminals. Sophie Mercer, the judge concluded, you will serve 6 years imprisonment for manslaughter, with eligibility for parole after serving 3 years. This sentence reflects both the seriousness of taking a human life and the extraordinary circumstances that drove you to this desperate action. I hope that during your incarceration you will find some measure of peace, and that upon your release you will be able to rebuild a productive life. As Sophie was led from the courtroom, she turned back to look at her mother. Mrs. Mercer pressed her hand to the glass, separating the dock from the public gallery, and Sophie mirrored the gesture. No words were spoken, but the love and anguish between mother and daughter were plain for all to see. Miss Marple left the courthouse feeling the weight of imperfect justice. Sophie would serve time for her crime, but the circumstances that had driven her to murder would also be acknowledged. The victims of West's exploitation would receive some measure of validation, though their suffering could never be fully redressed. The legal system had done its best, but Miss Marple suspected that no outcome could truly satisfy the demands of justice when the original crimes had been so heinous and the response to them so tragic. Chapter 9. The Village Reflects. In the weeks following Sophie Mercer's sentencing, St Mary Mead found itself grappling with uncomfortable questions about technology, privacy, and the nature of justice. The case had attracted considerable media attention, and the village's residents found themselves discussing issues they had never previously considered. Miss Marple attended a parish council meeting where the discussion focused on implementing new protections for residents using local business services. Several mothers voiced concerns about whether other businesses might be engaging in similar hidden surveillance. The vicar suggested establishing community guidelines for businesses that required access to changing rooms or other private spaces. Inspector Wilkins attended the meeting to provide information about protective measures. Modern technology makes hidden surveillance increasingly easy, he explained. Cameras can be concealed in ordinary objects, smoke detectors, electrical outlets, even decorative elements. The best protection is vigilance and insisting on transparent security policies from businesses you patronize. One of the attendees asked about Sophie Mercer. Many in the village felt conflicted about her conviction, understanding why she had acted, while also recognizing that murder could not be condoned. The vicar spoke thoughtfully about the moral complexities the case had revealed. We are called to forgive, but we are also called to justice. Sophie Mercer committed a serious crime, and she is rightly being held accountable. Yet we must also acknowledge that she was driven to violence by a predator who exploited legal loopholes to victimize vulnerable people. Both things can be true simultaneously. Miss Marple found herself invited to tea by several village residents who wanted to discuss the case privately. Over cups of Earl Grey and slices of Victoria sponge, she fielded questions about what she had observed during the investigation and what lessons might be drawn from the tragedy. One particularly thoughtful conversation took place with Mrs. Mercer, who had returned to St Mary Mead after Sophie's sentencing. The older woman was thin and worn, bearing visible signs of the ordeal she had endured. She thanked Miss Marple for her kindness during the investigation and for her testimony at trial. "I blame myself," Mrs. Mercer said quietly. "If I had gone to the police immediately when West first demanded money, perhaps none of this would have happened." Miss Marple reached across the table to pat Mrs. Mercer's hand. "My dear, you were victimized by a sophisticated predator who specifically designed his operation to exploit victims' fear and shame. The failure was not yours, but rather a system that did not adequately protect people in your position. Sophie did what she thought was necessary to protect me," Mrs. Mercer continued. "I wish she had not. I would rather have endured any amount of public humiliation than have her sacrifice her freedom for my sake." "I believe she understood that," Miss Marple replied gently. "But a daughter's protective instinct toward her mother is powerful, particularly when that mother has already sacrificed so much. Sophie saw you struggling and felt responsible because she worked for the man causing that suffering." The conversation turned to the future. Mrs. Mercer was planning to visit Sophie regularly in prison and was already looking forward to her daughter's eventual release. Several of West's other victims had formed a support group and had invited Mrs. Mercer to join, finding strength in shared experience and mutual understanding. Miss Marple also spent time considering the broader implications of the case. She attended a lecture at the village hall where a technology expert discussed digital privacy and the challenges of protecting personal information in an increasingly connected world. The expert explained that hidden camera technology had become so sophisticated and miniaturized that traditional methods of detection were often inadequate. "The law is struggling to keep pace with technology," the expert explained. "Regulations designed for an analog era do not adequately address digital surveillance capabilities. We need new frameworks for protecting privacy that acknowledge how easily modern technology can invade personal spaces." One evening, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Inspector Wilkins over dinner at the vicarage. The inspector had been invited to discuss community safety measures, but the conversation inevitably turned to Sophie Mercer's case. "I find myself troubled by how the legal system handles these situations," Inspector Wilkins admitted. "West's crimes were extensive and caused tremendous harm, yet he operated for years because victims were too frightened or ashamed to come forward. When Sophie decided to act, the legal system had essentially failed to provide protection. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. The challenge is that legal systems depend on victims being willing to endure the process of prosecution, which in cases involving intimate images means accepting additional exposure and humiliation. West understood this and built his operation around exploiting that vulnerability. "How do we prevent this in the future?" the vicar asked. "Surely there must be better ways to protect people from such predatory behaviour." "Education is part of the answer," Inspector Wilkins replied. "People need to understand the signs of hidden surveillance and feel empowered to demand transparency from businesses. But we also need legal reforms that allow prosecution of such crimes without requiring victims to have their private images displayed as evidence." Miss Marple added her own observation. "We also need to address the shame and stigma that prevents victims from seeking help. West's power came partly from his technical sophistication, but equally from social attitudes that make people feel responsible for their own victimization." The conversation continued late into the evening, exploring difficult questions about balancing privacy with security, protecting potential victims without creating oppressive surveillance of legitimate businesses, and ensuring that legal remedies were accessible to people in vulnerable positions. As Miss Marple walked home through the quiet village streets, she reflected on how profoundly technology had changed the nature of crime and justice. The camera, that had once been simply a tool for creating memories, had become, in West's hands, a weapon for exploitation. Sophie's response, while criminal, had been rooted in protective love and frustration with a system that seemed unable to help. The case had no entirely satisfactory resolution. Sophie would serve years in prison for taking a life, even as many acknowledged that she had been driven to violence by circumstances that offered no good alternatives. West's victims would carry their trauma forward, even as they found relief in his death and exposure of his crimes. The legal system would continue wrestling with how to protect privacy in a digital age, while maintaining the safeguards that prevented vigilante justice. Miss Marple entered her cottage and settled into her favourite chair with her knitting. The familiar rhythm of the needles provided comfort as she reflected on the complexity of human nature and the challenges of seeking justice in an imperfect world. The case was closed, but its lessons would remain with her and with St. Mary Mead for a long time to come. Chapter 10. The Final Photograph. 6 months after Sophie Mercer's sentencing, Miss Marple received a letter from the young woman. It had been forwarded through Inspector Wilkins, who maintained contact with Sophie to monitor her rehabilitation and provide information about the ongoing closure of West's criminal network. Miss Marple opened the envelope carefully and settled into her chair by the window to read. The letter was written in Sophie's neat handwriting on prison stationery. It began with an apology for any distress Miss Marple might have experienced during the investigation and thanked her for her kind testimony at trial. Sophie wrote about her daily life in prison, the counselling she was receiving, and her growing understanding of the psychological factors that had driven her to violence. "I have had much time to reflect," Sophie wrote, "and I understand now that while my motives were protective, my actions were wrong. Taking a life can never be justified, regardless of how terrible the victim's crimes were. I should have found another way, even if that meant my mother's privacy being violated. The cost of murder is too high, both for society and for one's own soul." The letter continued with updates about Mrs. Mercer, who was recovering slowly from the trauma of recent years. She had joined the support group for West's victims and had found strength in helping others who shared similar experiences. Sophie expressed gratitude that her mother was finally free from blackmail and able to begin healing. Most significantly, Sophie wrote about the unexpected positive outcome of the case. The publicity surrounding West's crimes and her trial had led to legislative action. Parliament was considering new laws specifically addressing hidden surveillance and revenge pornography, with enhanced protections for victims and harsher penalties for perpetrators. Several other photographers who had operated similar schemes had been investigated and prosecuted following the exposure of West's methods. "My crime has inadvertently helped create the legal protections that might have prevented it," Sophie wrote. This does not excuse what I did, but it provides some small comfort that my terrible mistake may help protect others in the future. The letter concluded with a request that touched Miss Marple deeply. Sophie asked if Miss Marple might visit her in prison, not to discuss the case, but simply to talk about ordinary things. The young woman was lonely and found that conversations with her mother were too weighted with guilt and sorrow. She remembered Miss Marple's kindness during the photography session with Chloe and hoped they might correspond occasionally if Miss Marple was willing. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and sat for a long moment looking out at her garden. The November gloom had given way to early spring, and crocuses were beginning to push through the soil. Life continued its cycles of death and renewal, tragedy and hope, justice and mercy. She composed a reply that afternoon agreeing to visit Sophie, and expressing her belief that redemption was possible for those who genuinely confronted their actions and sought to make amends. Over the following months, Miss Marple became a regular visitor at the prison, spending an hour every fortnight speaking with Sophie about books, gardening, village life, and other topics that provided respite from the young woman's guilt and confinement. During one visit, Sophie showed Miss Marple a photograph that she kept in her cell. It was the Halloween portrait that had been taken of Chloe, Miss Marple's great niece, during that 6 o'clock session on the evening before West's murder. In the photograph, Chloe beamed with delight in her witch costume, young and innocent and full of joy. "I asked your great-niece's mother if I might have a copy," Sophie explained. "I hope you do not mind. When I look at it, I remember why photography should exist, to capture moments of happiness and preserve memories that bring comfort. This reminds me of who I wanted to be and who I hope to become again someday." Miss Marple studied the photograph with its captured moment of childish delight. It seemed a fitting symbol of what the case had ultimately been about: the power of images to preserve both beauty and violation, to create joy and enable exploitation, to document truth and facilitate lies. "I do not mind at all," Miss Marple assured Sophie. "In fact, I think it is precisely the right photograph for you to keep. It reminds us that technology and human creativity can serve either good or evil purposes, depending entirely on the choices we make about how to use them. As spring deepened into summer and summer gave way to another autumn, life in St. Mary Mead gradually returned to normal rhythms. The photography studio space was eventually let to a bookshop, its walls repainted and its unfortunate history slowly fading into village memory. Mrs. Mercer remained in the village, slowly rebuilding her life with the support of friends and fellow survivors. The legislative reforms inspired by Sophie's case were enacted into law, providing new protections against hidden surveillance and establishing better support systems for victims of such violations. While no law could perfectly address every situation, the changes represented progress toward a more just approach to digital age privacy crimes. 3 years after her sentencing, Sophie Mercer became eligible for parole. Miss Marple attended the hearing as a character witness, speaking about the young woman's genuine remorse and the progress she had made toward rehabilitation. The parole board granted Sophie's release under strict conditions, including continued counselling and community service working with victims of exploitation. On the day of Sophie's release, Miss Marple met her outside the prison gates along with Mrs. Mercer. Mother and daughter embraced for long minutes, both crying with relief and joy. When they finally separated, Sophie turned to Miss Marple with gratitude evident in her expression. "Thank you for not abandoning me," Sophie said quietly. "Thank you for seeing me as more than just a murderer, for understanding that good people can do terrible things when circumstances become unbearable." Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear, I've lived long enough to understand that human nature is complex, and that justice must account for both actions and circumstances. You made a terrible choice, but you have accepted responsibility and worked toward redemption. That is all any of us can do when we fail." As they drove back to St. Mary Mead, with Mrs. Mercer and Sophie reunited at last, Miss Marple reflected on the case that had begun on that Halloween evening 18 months earlier. Justice had been served, though imperfectly. Sophie had been punished for taking a life, but the circumstances that drove her to violence had also been acknowledged. West's victims had found support and validation, though their suffering could never be fully erased. Most importantly, the case had sparked changes that might protect future potential victims from similar exploitation. Sometimes, Miss Marple thought, tragedy was necessary to reveal failures in systems and inspire reforms. The cost was terrible, but perhaps not entirely wasted if it led to genuine progress. The autumn sun was setting as they arrived in St. Mary Mead, casting golden light across the village green where children played without fear. Miss Marple watched Sophie take her first breath of free air in her home village, saw her mother's protective hand on her shoulder, and felt cautiously hopeful about the future. The case of the Halloween photography studio was closed, but its echoes would continue, in the laws it had inspired, in the victims it had helped protect, in the young woman who had committed murder and was now seeking redemption. The story would persist, and Miss Marple would remember it as a reminder that justice, while essential, was rarely simple, and that the human capacity for both terrible violence and genuine redemption existed side by side in the same complicated hearts.